These blades are the implements of one of the greatest conflicts in human history. The product of vicious trench warfare, these are the M1917 and M1918 Mark I trench knives. These knuckle knives are immediately recognizable from their brutal profiles and are inseparable icons of the reality of the First World War. While the Great War was the first modern war featuring the full might of automatic weaponry, advanced artillery, and chemical warfare, it still had a place for a simple piece of sharp steel. Today on The Knife Life, we are digging into the origins and history of the US trench knives in World War I and beyond. Let's get into it. To understand the US trench knife, we need to look at the world it comes from, World War I, also known as the Great War, the War of the Nations, and the War to End All Wars. But we know how that last one turned out. It was the first conflict to feature industrial and mechanized weaponry on a grand scale and set the stage for all of world history to follow. The iconic image of this great calamity is that of the mud-ridden trenches, fortifications dug deep into the earth in order to provide soldiers protection. And protection was sorely needed. Machine guns were bad enough, but perhaps the worst part of the war was the relentless use of artillery. Mass frontal attacks of the previous century proved inadequate against these new weapons and hardened fortifications. Various methods were tried in order to cross no man's land and attack the enemy, but one of the most effective tactics was trench raiding. Soldiers from both sides would sneak across no man's land under cover of darkness in small parties and launch limited attacks. Silence was of the utmost importance, as a gunshot would alert the enemy to your presence and potentially kill your entire unit. As a result, the trench knife would emerge as one of the preferred weapons of raiders and those who fought against them. Neither the Allied or Central Powers were well equipped for what World War I would evolve into, and as such, most early trench knives were crude and improvised weapons made by soldiers themselves. Excellent examples of this are the French nails, improvised shanks made from the steel posts used to hang barbed wire. These posts would have a point hammered into shape on one end, and the back looped around in order to create a grip or guard. 1886 Lebel bayonets were another favorite item that were often modified into serviceable trench knives. English troops found themselves in similar situations, and in some cases found themselves using knives reminiscent of the Sheffield Bowie knives of the 1800s. In fact, Germany was the only great power that had an issued trench knife at the start of the war in the form of their Nahkampfmesser. However, it was ultimately the French that the US would closely follow for their knives. By mid-war, trench knives had begun to improve and more standardized blades were being issued to troops. Of particular note was the French M1916 trench knife, often known as Le Vengeur de 1870. This alluded to the French defeat to Prussian forces in 1870. It featured a simple but effective double-edged blade, stamped crossguard, and wooden grip. It was an effective and easy to manufacture knife that was popular among French troops. In 1916, the US had not yet been dragged into the war, but it was uneasily eyeing the situation in Europe after the sinking of the Lusitania, killing 128 Americans. In that same year, the US military issued a request for the development of trench knives to issue to its troops in the case of war. Shortly after, the US was drawn into the conflict in April 1917. The M1917 trench knife was the first issued American trench knife designed by Distin & Sons Company. Distin & Sons was primarily a manufacturer of hand tools and saws, but wasn't really a cutlery company. The base design of the M1917 was derived from French knives that had been in service for a good portion of the war. In particular, the 1886 Lebel knives would have been influential. The end result was a particularly nasty-looking stiletto-type blade measuring 9 inches or about 23 centimeters long. Calling the M1917 a knife could be considered a bit of a stretch, as in reality, it is essentially a glorified ice pick. Looking down the tip, you can see the triangular cross-section of the blade. The M1917 has no cutting edge at all. It is highly reminiscent of earlier bayonets from the American Civil War and older. Not exactly cutting edge for the time, but you get the point. So why make a really pointy stick for a trench knife? The purpose of the M1917 was obviously for thrusting. The idea was to create something with a sharp enough point with enough structure behind it that it would be able to drive through heavy clothing. Remember that the trenches were often wet and cold. Heavy trench coats were common on the front lines in addition to thick woolen uniforms. Fabric clothing can be a surprisingly effective armor against cuts. Unlike its 1886 Lebel predecessor, however, a guard was added to the grip to protect its owner's knuckles. There were two main methods of manufacture for the grip. One method was to stamp studs into the guard, such as on this Atlanta Cutlery replica. The second method was a flanged guard that bent extra tabs on the guard forward in order to achieve a similar effect. The whole ensemble was finished off with a wooden handle featuring finger grooves for a better grip. The M1917 was issued in large quantities to US troops bound for the Western Front and performed decently, but also demonstrated its shortcomings. Broken blades were not uncommon, and their inability to cut left much to be desired from a utilitarian standpoint. One veteran also described the M1917 as a monstrosity which was always in the way and when accidentally struck against anything rang like a bell. Not particularly desirable when conducting raids. The US military took note of the M1917's performance and began to look for something better. In June of 1918, the US military performed a series of tests with the M1917 and several of its Allied contemporaries. The tests were intended to gauge a number of characteristics of each knife, such as serviceability, speed, retention, weight, and so on. While it didn't perform terribly, the M1917 left something to be desired. The answer was the M1918 Mark I knife. The double-edged 6-inch, or about 15-centimeter blade is a close copy of the French 1916 L'Avenger. The cast brass grip featured a top guard to protect the hand, as well as protruding spikes on each of the knuckle guards. The nut used to hold the grip in place was also tapered to a point and referred to as a skull crusher, with an obvious use. The grip itself is surprisingly comfortable, while also providing sufficient support in the palm to safely use the brass knuckles. The knuckles also provide decent retention so that the knife is not easily lost. While many modern pictures show the bright brass of the grip, the knives were often darkened at the factory for stealth. This finish often wore off with time or was purposefully removed by soldiers for the aesthetics. Overall, the M1918 featured a more compact size in comparison to its M1917 predecessor at a similar weight, with the added advantage of being able to cut. Interestingly enough, though, the only versions of this blade to see service in World War I were French-made. The French firm Ulion produced a number of these blades and made them available to US troops. The US did place orders with 4 domestic companies as well, but before the knives could be delivered, fighting ceased November 11, 1918. The US canceled all of the contracts except for the order placed with Landers, Frary, and Clark. These domestically produced M1918s went directly into storage. It is ironic that one of the most recognizable knives of the Great War in fact saw limited use in the trenches. After the armistice, it appeared that the time of the trench knife had passed. But before we move on to the next part of this story, here is my question for this video. Which trench knife do you prefer, the M1917 or the M1918? Let me know which one and why in the comments below. Both the M1917 and M1918 Mark I lingered in storage after the close of World War I, as the US military had little use for them during peacetime. Of course, the peace inflicted by the Treaty of Versailles only lasted for about 2 decades, until a certain Austrian painter set his sights on Europe. With the outbreak of war, many countries were unprepared and began digging into old stores in order to supply their troops. The United States found itself in the same situation after the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. Mass mobilization required mass quantities of equipment, something the US was short of in the knife department. Many soldiers were forced to procure or fabricate their own knives for their service due to the low supply of knives. In fact, some of the only knives that the US government actually did have any quantity of were the old M1918 Mark I knives delivered just after the end of the previous World War. The Mark I's were dug out of inventory and issued to the more elite Ranger and paratrooper units. The remaining M1917 trench knives were also dug out of storage as US ordnance officials scraped at the bottom of the barrel to get soldiers ready with anything that they had. There was a brief period where production of additional Mark I knives was considered, but this was discarded in favor of other knives. The large amount of brass required for the grip was a key point against the Mark I in a wartime economy, and new blades that either performed better or were easier to produce found their way into soldiers' hands. The Marine Raider stiletto, a variation of the Fairbairn Sykes knife, was issued to Ranger units. The famous K-bar fighting utility knife became the main knife for both the Marines and the Navy, and the M3 combat knife was adopted by the US Army. By 1943, the old trench knives had largely been displaced in service, but not all of them. Pictures of both the M1917 and Mark I knives can be seen with troops throughout the duration of World War II. The use of knuckle knives has largely died out since the end of World War II, but you will occasionally see them still pop up from time to time, mostly in enthusiasts' collections these days. A decent number of original M1917 and M1918 Mark I still exist, but they are becoming increasingly expensive over time. For those looking at procuring either of these trench knives on a budget, check out the Atlanta Cutlery reproductions. Atlanta Cutlery was kind enough to provide the blades for this video. Be sure to take a look at their site. I also want to thank Thomas Andy for his insight and feedback on this video. If you're interested in historical collectibles, keep an eye out for some of his books and a knife-related project in the future. And for those interested in learning more about trench knives, I recommend joining the Model 1918 Trench Knife and Variations group on Facebook. They are a very welcoming and knowledgeable community you definitely should take advantage of. And as always, let me know in the comments which blade you'd like to see in the knife life in future. Until next time, stay safe and keep living the knife life.